So this episode feels like the right time for the sage wisdom of that great philosopher, Olivia Newton-John. Let's get physical. We want to get physical.
That's really deep. Let's get into that.
Before we get into today's episode, just wanted to remind you that in the description of the video below, we put links to all of our social media accounts.
You can always reach us with questions or comments about this episode at marriagebydesignpodcast@gmail.com.
And finally, if you want to support us financially, there is a link to be able to do so at the end of each of the descriptions of our videos. Now, let's get back to the show. Hey, everybody, I'm Nate Warnock.
I'm Andrea Warnock, and you've joined us for Marriage Monday on the Marriage by Design podcast. This is a time that we get to talk to you about God's design for marriage, what the Bible has to say about it, and how Nathan and I live that out practically.
That's right. So we have been going through a series on what we're calling the intimacy table, which if you think of a table with 4 legs, one on each corner, we've been talking about intimacy in the scope of our intimacy in our relationships and our marriage specifically, because one of those legs, sexual intimacy, is specific to marriage. But if you want to have a marriage that is strong enough, sturdy enough of a foundation to take on the grind of life and everything that gets thrown at us over the course of our lives as a married couple, you really need these 4 legs of intimacy. And so many couples might be really good in one or maybe really good in 2, but then a couple of them are uncomfortable to them, and so they just don't pursue them at all. And it really throws the intimacy in their relationship completely off kilter, because so much of intimacy in relationship is codependent, one intimacy on another. So those 4 pillars of intimacy are emotional, which we talked about last week, physical, but non-sexual, that's what we're going to talk about this week, spiritual, which we'll talk about next week, and then sexual, which we'll talk about in week 4. So the way that this is going to happen today is we're going to just give a little bit of background and sort of broad discussion on physical intimacy within relationship and within marriage, and then talk a little bit about, practically how do we approach physical intimacy within marriage. And we watched Princess Bride with our 2 oldest kids last night, and so every time so far that I have said marriage, I have almost said marriage. So if I say marriage a couple of times during this podcast, you will know we watched The Princess Bride. Okay, so one thing that strikes me straight away about physical intimacy, and there's going to be maybe a bit of projecting in this episode, so man, tell us in the comments below if you feel like I'm incorrect in what I'm about to say, but it feels like physical but non-sexual intimacy is a pretty difficult one for a lot of relationships, and emotional intimacy for sure is a problem in a lot of folks' relationship, but man, it's really hard to have a relationship with healthy, with a lot of physical intimacy if you don't have emotional intimacy. Mm-hmm. But I think there's a lot of relationships that have decent emotional intimacy but don't explore the physical intimacy very much. And certainly there are relationships, for sure, that have a decent amount of sexual intimacy, but no non-sexual physical intimacy, which actually is a problem we're going to need to address during this episode.
So physical intimacy seems to be like one of those things that when you're in a new relationship, it's exciting to like be physically close to them and have reasons to touch them and hold hands or whatever it is.
Sure.
And then over the time of a relationship, as you get comfortable, for a lot of people, it seems like that just kind of goes away. That wanes a lot. And there's only two people that I can think of over the entirety of my life, which has been quite a long time. There's only two couples that I can think of that have been married, one of them for a very, very long time, and the other a decent amount of years. That physical intimacy seems to never have waned, and they're both of those couples still constantly finding reasons to touch and hold hands, and that sweet physical
Right.
relationship that you see, not in a gross way, but in a very sweet way.
Right.
And it's so noticeable because it's so out of the ordinary.
Right. No, that's right.
And those two couples seem to be very close in not just physically, but in their marriage, in kind of always in their marriage.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably right.
And,
oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and like I said, it's so noticeable because it's so out of the ordinary.
Right. One thing that strikes me straight up front is human beings. We are created physical beings. Like when you cannot read through the Bible and not see how important of a role physical intimacy, maybe not at a super deep level, but at least physical touching, is integral to what it means to be human. And you think about so many examples in the Bible where the Lord wanted to do a work in someone's life, particularly in the area of healing. God did not need Jesus to spit in the dirt and make mud out of it. I mean, Jesus didn't. The Holy Spirit didn't. The Trinity did not need Jesus to do that and physically put his hands on the guy's eyes in order to heal him.
Mm-hmm.
But he did.
Mm-hmm.
Right? When we talk about healing, when we're directed in the Bible on praying for healing for others, we're directed to place our hands on those individuals and ask for healing. Certainly Jesus, there's a number of examples. I mean, washing the disciples' feet, right? There's a number of examples that involved physical touching. Certainly Jesus did not shy away from being physically intimate.
Woman who washed his feet with her hair.
Right.
Yeah, that was a pretty intimate physical, act.
Right. And it's easy to go, oh, well, culturally, they were just much more physical than us Americans are. But I would say that's not entirely true. I mean, for us in the United States, a very common greeting when you greet someone else is to physically touch them. And really interesting, one of the big takeaways I had from 2020 when we were all dealing with the COVID stuff was people going, man, you know what is weird, but that I miss shaking people's hands. I mean, I heard that from a number of people, not my wife, because she thinks everyone has diseases. But
now we're just letting everybody know I'm sort of a germaphobe, but I keep it under wraps.
Right. So if you ever have a chance to meet Andrea, shake both her hands and then give her a big hug and cough on her.
It's fine.
But really interesting, even psychologically. So the idea of the handshake is traced back in the United States to the Quakers, but even before that, it was meant as sort of this, like, hey, I'm offering you my body as sort of a sign of goodwill, right? Because if I'm offering you my hand to shake, I'm not holding a sword in it.
A part of my body.
Right?
Right.
And similarly, there's all sorts of little psychological things that we do that there are not a lot of explanations for, but some of them, psychologists' best guess are that they're little physical tics. For example, the classic, sort of dating example is, when girls like move their hair, that little like flirty move where you like move your hair behind your ear.
Or to one side. Yeah, so your neck is exposed.
Right. And that's exactly the thing, is that you're exposing a part of your body physically. Now, again, I'm not trying to.
It's
say
like a
you should go
vulnerable
down
part.
that road,
It's like a vulnerable part of your body.
right. It's like you're leaving a vulnerable part of your body exposed. My point in saying that is we're coded at a very deep level as humans to interpret things, and in some cases even inadvertently send off signals that are physical signals. And okay. And I share all of that. And if you're listening, Andrea just pulled her hair down all around her neck. So when we think about this, the point is, sometimes Andrea and I hear from couples, well, I'm just not a physical person. I'm not discounting that, but I'm saying certainly there are some people, I mean, the 5 love languages are a thing. There are some people where physical touch is very high, like me, and some people where physical touch is very low, like
other
someone
people.
else I know.
It's like bottom of the barrel for me.
Right. But to say, oh, I'm just not a physical person, my response to that would be, that's not the way you were created.
Right.
So there probably has been trauma that has caused you to go down that road. And certainly you would say that's
sure.
the case with you. Now maybe physical, maybe it's not like physical touch would be like through the roof,
right?
How were it not for those things? But there's no way to think those things, no way to say those things wouldn't have an effect.
Right. Yeah. Right? Trauma can definitely have an effect on that, a huge effect on that, but also the way you were raised. So I was raised in a really great home, but physical touch wasn't a big thing for us. And so that for me, it was just normal to not have a lot of physical touch. Whereas Nathan's family was opposite, and they were much more touchy with each other. That sounds bad, but I don't mean it like that.
True.
They were just more physical with each other in a very loving way, in a very appropriate way. And so he grew up in that. I grew up in a home that wasn't as much. And so you bring us together, and that alone is going to create some difference, in expectation and in desire and normalcy, the thought of normalcy.
Right.
And then you add past issues, problems, traumas, that sort of thing onto it, and it makes it more difficult.
Right. So two things with what you just said. One is, right up front, there's really never been a couple we've ever met with where one of them did not have a desire for physical intimacy that outpaced the other. And again, and I need to be really clear about this. I've said it a bunch of times. I'm not talking about sexual intimacy here. I'm talking about just holding hands, giving non-suggestive back rubs, right? Like just while you're like standing, around. Someone sitting on, like your wife sitting on your lap, or I guess your husband sitting on your lap, or
just running your hand across their back as you go by them.
Right. Yeah. Just
all sorts of things.
Physical connection that's not sexual. So the first thing that I want to point out is we really have to, this is one of those times where we can really live out that verse about live with your wives in an understanding way. And of course that verse goes both ways. We can come into it with just a frustration, right? Because it can be something, as like Andrea said, as simple as that your spouse was raised with different expectations of, physical touch than you. I mean, I can give an example. There are things even to this day sometimes that I'll, put my hand on Andrea's, hip pocket or something like that, where I don't mean it in a sexual way, but it makes her uncomfortable in public because she interprets that as, like an inappropriate physical touching in public. And I don't mean it that way. I don't even think of it that way. But that's how she interprets it. And so there are times when your spouse might not even be thinking about physical touch, and in your mind you're going, man, why doesn't she put her arm around me? Why doesn't he put his arm around me?
Totally.
Why doesn't she give me a hug when we're both standing here in the kitchen early in the morning? or at lunchtime, or in mid-morning, or in the early afternoon, or
Totally.
she just, and so in your mind, it's easy to go. It's easy to go right to frustration and condemnation, instead of living with our spouse in an understanding way.
Yeah, and I think not living in that, like, why doesn't my spouse do this? Just do it then. If you're wanting that, just do it. And I think as your spouse lives with you and starts understanding your desire or even just your thoughts of physical touch and how often you're doing that and thinking about that, they're probably going to be starting to think that way too. You know, so if you're standing there thinking, well, right by each other, why doesn't she just hold my hand? Well, just hold her hand then.
Right. Right. Yeah, this goes back to this thing we've talked about before about, the example is we can't hold our spouse, and this is really hard for us to not fall into. We can't hold our spouse to that standard of, I don't want them to do the dishes. I want them to want to do the dishes. It's an unfair standard, and it really creates a schism in your relationship that doesn't belong there, right? And I know it's easy to fall into because it's easy to go, well, yeah, I could hold her hand anytime, but I want her to want to hold my hand. Well, maybe someday she will, but right now she's not even thinking that way, right? And we're going to talk towards the end about how to approach those conversations with your spouse, because again, this is of these 4 intimacies, this is probably the one we have struggled with traditionally the most.
It's me. I'm the problem. It's me.
I mean, just struggle meaning I have different expectations than you. And I don't know that it's always been that way, but I think, last while it has been. So, and here's why. Because it used to be, of these 4, the ones we used to struggle with are yes. I think we used to just struggle with all of them. But that's not the case anymore. Praise the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so here's the second thing that I wanted to say. And it goes back to this physical but not sexual. One of the reasons that I think physical intimacy gets sort of thrown under the bus in a lot of relationships is because, not always, but I'm going to call out the guys in particular on this one. Guys have not been very good about making there a clear delineation between non-sexual physical touching and physical touching. Sexual physical touching, right? It's been like, hey, babe, do you want a back rub? And she's like, yeah, I want a back rub. And so you start giving her a back rub, and then pretty soon you're not rubbing her back. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. That's good for you. But at the same time, if it sends the message to your spouse that anytime I hold your hand or touch your back or run my hands through your hair, it's really me sending you a message that I'm, trying to get physical in the way Olivia Newton-John was insinuating in that song, right? That's going to really put a strain on this physical.
So how do we fix that
side? Through building up. I mean, it has to be built up in trust, right? I mean, you have to. There has to be a physical aspect to your relationship that doesn't lead.
Yeah, and if you have a spouse who's thinking every time you touch them, your mind is just, oh, I hope this leads to sex, then there may need to be some really uncomfortable but very clear, like, hey, I just want to rub your back, and this is nothing more than that.
Yeah, and
for a while, you
right.
know.
And in some ways, I've talked about this in the past, but in some ways, because there was a time when you were like, well, I feel like every time you touch me physically, you're thinking about sex. And my response to that eventually had to be like, well, but here's
yes.
the thing. I was thinking about sex before I was touching your back. So I'm like, the issue's not thinking about sex in our relationship. I'm already thinking about that. The issue is...
So what he means is he's never not.
Right. But my point in that is I said that tongue in cheek to hopefully free her up to go, well, he really just wants to rub my back. And now, for Andrea, there's never been a time, and this, I know this is specific to us because I know not every couple's like this, where if Andrea was like, oh, thanks for holding my hand, do you want to have sex? I would never be like, no, I just want to hold your hand. Right? But that's specific to us. But the point is that over time, there's, I think, has been this trust built up where when I'm holding your hand and then we stop holding hands, I'm not going to stand there like a puppy waiting for you to
jump in bed.
Ask me if you want to go, if we want to go to bed. And that's really where this can get off early on in marriage. I mean, I think this is a trap for young marrieds that can go down this road of, because we've been holding hands for a long time, but for Christian couples at least, but we couldn't have sex at that point. So now we're still going to hold hands because I like that, but then when we're done holding hands, we're going to have sex. And at some point it's like, well, that really, it puts a ton of pressure on her, and it puts pressure on the physical side of your relationship because every time you want to hold her hand, she's feeling all the pressure of an upcoming sexual encounter, and she may not even been thinking about that. And go see all the episodes we've done on sex. The other side of that is, if ladies in particular, if that's how you feel, that needs to be communicated, because the communication cannot be withdrawing physical attention. And again, I'm talking about physical, not sexual, because he'll stop. Like, if every time he goes to hold your hand, you pull your hand back because you're thinking, I don't want this to lead down a sexual road, but you're not saying that, you're just pulling your hand back. It doesn't take super long to train a guy. And he'll just stop trying to hold your hand. And man, if we haven't had a lot of couples we've talked to where she went, well, he never tries to touch me. He never tries to hold my hand or rub my back or do anything non-sexual. And he goes, well, I used to, and you would seem to freak out about it, so I just stopped because I thought you were uncomfortable. To which she goes, well, that's because when you were doing it, you only seemed to care about that if it led to sex. And when we go, well, did y'all ever talk about this? Well, I thought he knew. Right? I thought she knew.
Yeah.
So you got to talk about this if that's an issue in your relationship, for sure. Okay.
You want to hear a funny shirt that I've seen?
Yes.
So it's a maternity shirt, and it said, all I really wanted was a back rub.
I have seen that shirt. That's great. That's great.
Anyway.
Yeah, and Andrea's worn that shirt 5 times. Okay.
That's not true.
All right. So moving into kind of the practical, babe. So maybe share kind of from your standpoint as you think about, the physical intimacy leg of this table.
Yeah.
Practically, how do we work on that as couples in a relationship? And I suppose could be dating couples or engaged couples or married couples in this case.
Sure. Well, for sure, I think for me, it's always, this is one of those things that I see as a journey for my whole life. I'm not sure I will have ever arrived, although that'd be great if I do. But just because I'm really, really not a physical touch person, really, really not with adults. It's a journey. And so I think if we approach it that way of like, this is not going to be something that's going to be solved next week, but we have, our whole lives together to journey on this. I think that's important for a lot of these things that feel like big mountains to climb.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, having that conversation with your spouse, if you're the one who's really low on the physical touch needs, having a conversation with your spouse, just being honest about that. Like, my needs for physical touch are really low, which means that I'm probably just not thinking about it a lot. It's just not something that I naturally think about. So I'm not even making the choice of like, oh, I don't want to touch you. I'm not making a choice. I'm just not thinking about it. And so, making that a point of prayer, because it is important to have physical touch in your relationship, even if you feel like that's not really anything I want. It is important because it's part of this table where they all these points of intimacy or legs of intimacy do feed off each other. And
Yeah, they really
even
do.
as somebody who's super low on needing physical touch in my marriage, I notice that when I make it when I try to really make it something that I'm thinking about and pursuing, it really does feed into all the other areas of intimacy. It just does. And so, having that in balance is a necessity. So making that a point of prayer. And if some of the reason that you don't desire physical touch or that you really struggle with physical touch with your spouse is because you have past trauma, maybe you have relationships in the past that you feel like you haven't surrendered to the Lord, and you have still kind of like a soul tie with that person. Sexual assault type things, all those things, if they have not been worked out with the Lord and really allowed God to work in your heart on those and heal those areas, that's probably going to be something that's going to keep you from having not only just the physical part of your relationship, but all areas of your marriage that should be, vulnerable and healthy.
Right.
And so I would really encourage you to work those out. And if you're wondering how the heck do I work those out? Reach out to us. You don't need to tell us what you're dealing with. Just, hey, I have some heart issues that I feel like I need to have the Lord work in. What do I do? And we can give you some resources.
For sure. Marriage by Design podcast@gmail.com.
So I think those are some big things. I've had to do a lot of work and continue to have to do some work with some past, some things in my past that have been hurts, that keep me from really diving in deep with that physical intimacy with Nathan. So that's one thing. If I think telling your spouse, this is not really something I think of. So can you take the lead on that? Especially really having that conversation. If your spouse has a higher need, can you take the lead? Can you, if we are standing next to each other and think, why are we not holding hands? Can you just hold my hand? And I am telling you that I'm going to really try to lean into that, and not pull my hand away and not think he's thinking of sex or whatever. I'm going to trust you, and I'm going to fall into your lead. And then I think, at least for us, that helps my brain to just have this ding. Oh yeah, I need to be thinking about physical touch myself too.
Yeah. That's good.
And then that helps your spouse to not be bitter, hopefully, in those moments where it's like, I wish she would sit by me right now rather than sitting on her own chair. Okay, then just say it. Rather than sitting there and being bitter that she doesn't, just say hey, can you come sit over by me? And then he or she can make that choice, and hopefully they're making a good choice to, do that. So giving the opportunity to your spouse.
I loved what you said about just doing it can serve to help build new pathways in your brain, in our case, to start thinking about that.
Right. And it does give your it does give your spouse the opportunity to respond with physical touch. Okay,
That's
so
right.
maybe he or she is not initiating it or initiating the idea of it, but they're responding with it.
Right.
So hey, how about you come sit with me on this chair, with me on the couch, or just kind of an invitation.
Right.
Of physical touch, and then they can respond, then at least shows that they're in it with you on that.
Right. So what do we do how do you address the conversation piece of it? Or maybe what I hear you saying maybe is you don't even need to have a conversation about it unless you're initiating and your spouse is somehow reacting
No, I think if this
really
is
negatively.
No, I think that particularly if this is something that's going to be a big change in your relationship, I think it is necessary to have a conversation to say, regardless of which spouse you are, but to say, man, I feel like physical touch is something that we lack in our marriage. And of course, explaining this is not a, this is physical, not sexual. And I really want to grow that, and having that conversation of so that it's not just all of a sudden, bam, or no conversation, and I'm trying to touch you more, and you're like what the heck, So yeah, have a conversation.
Yeah, that's fair.
But being careful to not be accusatory, because you don't know, unless you've had the conversation a lot and the other person is like, I know you want physical touch and I don't care. Okay, but approaching it with love and grace and just saying, I really want this. I think it's great for our relationship. I think it's great for our kids to see, whatever it is. Let's work on that.
Right. And to just underscore, it's if they say, I don't care about that. Not if in your mind you're going, well, I don't think she cares about that, or I don't think he cares about that. Right.
Mm-hmm. And if their response is no, then I'm sure that hurts, but don't allow that to define the rest of your relationship. So don't just say, well, that's the way it is, and that's what I have to live with. Continue to bring that, continue to bring that to the Lord in prayer, but also continue to pursue that with your spouse in when you feel like you need to bring it up again, and not in a nagging way or an accusatory way. But just saying, I really believe that this is important, and I really want the best marriage that we can have, and that's a piece of it.
Right. Another piece of this is asking about how they interpret different kinds of physical touch. Because I know different people have different, flows, and you may be like, man, I really like, holding the back of my wife, like rubbing the back of my wife's neck, which I do. But you may be with someone that's like, that's like a sexual thing for me. So it makes me uncomfortable.
Or that may be a really
ticklish or whatever.
Yeah, that may feel like I'm under your control, type of thing. That may feel like a controlling thing to your spouse. Who knows?
Right. Yeah. So having open conversation about, what is meaningful physical touch mean? But the conversation, having it in the context of this is going to happen. Right, like this is something that's important for our relationship, that we have this intimacy in our marriage. So how can I pursue you in that? And, using this podcast series as if you're like, man, I don't even know how to bring that up, then use us, right? I mean, hey, I happened to come across this podcast. They were talking about these 4, pillars of intimacy that make this intimacy table. And I don't know, I think they're completely crazy. But what do you think that, what do you feel like is our weakest area of intimacy in our marriage? That's a great lead in to be able to have a conversation. And, then you can share, like, as I was thinking about it, I was thinking, seems like we struggle in the area of physical intimacy. Do you agree with that? How could we improve in that? Right. It's a conversation starter. So totally, use these in that regard.
Yeah. One thing I want to say is if you're in a place in life where you're raising young kids, you're probably you could be getting touched out a lot. And for me, that's the case. I stay home with our kids, and my physical touch is low anyway, but,
kids
my
like
needs,
to touch you?
Well, I don't have like a physical touch for the most part, like cap with my kids, but it can really get me to, being around my kids all day and having them all over me and touching me and all that. It's great and I love it, but it can also, I can get towards the end of the day with Nathan and be like, oh my gosh, I just want some space, Yeah. And so if you're in a place of life where you've got young kids and that's your situation, is that you kind of just feel touched out sometimes and like you need some space, then I think being honest with that, as long as it's not every day, but being honest with that of like, whoa, today was a crazy day and I just kind of need my space today, is is necessary, and hopefully your spouse will honor that. Again, as long as it's not a routine thing where you're like, oh, I can't do the physical touch thing today. I'm whatever.
That makes 8 years in a row.
Right. Right. So having some understanding with each other that we're in a place of life where we're giving a lot, and some of that is with our physical touch, and
Right.
so we may not always have it, but when we don't have these young kids, it'll probably look different. Ethan hopes.
That's great. That's right. Guys, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate you checking this out. I would love to know what, tips you guys have in your own relationships on how you've improved in physical intimacy within your relationship. Always looking for the community to see what you guys have found that works. How do you approach these conversations with your spouse or significant other, and how do you dig into that, and what do you find works, what do you find doesn't? So please feel free to put those down in the comments below or over on our Facebook page at the Marriage by Design Facebook page. There will be a post dedicated to this video over there. Guys, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate you being here. Until next week, have a great week, and remember, God is for your marriage.